What is supported by solid evidence is that history has shown that Western governments have made a consistent policy of engaging in covert operations, including false flag terrorist attacks. Yesterday's conspiracy theories are today's declassified history. In this context, it is not only our right but our responsibility to ask serious questions about who carried out terrorist attacks and who benefited from them.
Okay, welcome everyone to episode 12 of the Smells Like Human Spirit podcast. We're joined today by Tom Secker, who is a British-based writer, researcher, and filmmaker who specializes in terrorism, the security services, and declassified history. He's been writing on the philosophy and politics of fear since 2008, and in particular has produced two documentaries in relation to the July 7th bombings in London, 7/7 Seeds of Deconstruction, and 7/7 Crime and Prejudice.
At the beginning of your documentary, you talk about the history of governments, beginning with the US, with their lies and propaganda used as fuel to justify invading countries. Well, Guy and I have mentioned this before in previous episodes, that due to the history of lies by governments to justify wars, surely the first thing to do is to question the official story, which is exactly what you're doing, and I applaud you for that, Tom.
Well, I mean, thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for the applause. Yeah, I think it's something that Dr. Daniela Ganser said best, is that, you know, whenever a major violent event, whether it be a terrorist attack or something more kind of warlike, you know, if you're talking about Pearl Harbor or whatever, the first thing you should always ask is, you know, is this the state acting against us, or is this some kind of private group or private network or whatever that's just carried out an atrocity for its own aims? That, you know, that question should be where we proceed from. If you rule that out from the very beginning, if you rule out the possibility of some kind of state involvement, whether it be collusion or an out-and-out false flag or whatever, if you rule that out from the beginning, then you're really just being intellectually and historically and morally dishonest.
Exactly, and I think the key point there is historically, as James mentioned, Tom, in your documentaries, you go through the history of Western governments in particular in staging false flag attacks and putting their finger on the wrong perpetrators of attacks. So there's clearly a precedent for the public to ask questions. Just to start us off, I was wondering if you could go a little bit into your background. Why are you so particularly interested in 7/7? And just give the listeners who are perhaps not familiar with your work just an introduction into who you are and what you're all about.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm a British-based filmmaker. I suppose I got into all of this because I've had a long-standing fascination with spies, basically, I think is what it most fundamentally boils down to. I was one of those kids who I was just obsessed with the intelligence services, or the way that spying works, the way that deception works as part of combat. All of these things were just something I was kind of profoundly struck by, that this was an incredibly interesting topic, and a topic that's a real kind of challenge to understand. And so, you know, as I got older and read things like George Orwell, I started asking these questions of the events that I was actually seeing unfold in reality, in real history. And then, obviously, 9/11 happened, and I was kind of, you know, as blown away by it as almost anyone, but at the same time, I just had this kind of gut reaction that what I was seeing didn't match up to what we were being told about it. And from there, I suppose it was probably a couple of years after that, someone really provoked me to start watching documentaries and then reading the 9/11 Commission report and actually finding out what it is that had gone down in the historical record as what had happened that day. And that was just, you know, there's excuse me, there's so many lies in that story, there's so many problems in that story that it, you know, take a lifetime to document them all, to be honest. And then I suppose a couple of years after I'd started getting into all of that, 7/7 happened. And so again, I just sort of had this gut reaction listening to and watching the media coverage of it, that there was that there was something desperately wrong here. I've never been able to quite put my finger on what I think is sort of going on behind the shadows with 7/7, but I am very, very much convinced that official story just isn't true. So I had to finish my degree and things, and then it was probably around 2009 I kind of committed to making a documentary about this, because there hadn't been a major 7/7 documentary, certainly not an alternative one, a decent one, since 2006, 2007, and there'd been a whole bunch more stuff that had come out since then, and there was I just felt there was a lot of material, particularly to do with this question of spies and this question of double agents and what have you, that needed looking at and that people would be interested in and needed to see.
Sure.
So that's when I made my first film. That's when I made 7/7 Seeds of Deconstruction.
Well, one thing I find really interesting there, Tom, is, and I've heard you discuss this on another interview as well, is your gut reaction to 7/7 and also 9/11, which I would venture to say is different from the gut reaction of the general public. It certainly differs from my gut reaction when those events happened. You say that you can't quite particularly pinpoint why you had that reaction, but if you could nail down a particular red flag or a series of inconsistencies and outright lies, as you say, with 7/7, if you were to kind of, for the uninitiated, so to speak, if you were to kind of outline what they are, what would you say to that?
No, fair question. Right, well, I mean, thinking back, when I was listening to the coverage of 7/7 on the radio, because I didn't start watching the rolling television news until kind of later in the day. I can't remember why that is, but I just remember I had to listen to it on the radio. And it started out with this story of trains colliding and possibly being derailed, and this somehow causing a power surge in the tube network. And then that very, very quickly evolved into this story of a terrorist attack. And I think it was within 2 hours of the bombings, you had people putting out this line in the media about it bearing all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. It's not something I picked up on, I don't think, at the time, specifically that phrase, but it's an important phrase. It's one that then becomes a sort of mantra for everyone talking about 7/7 for the next couple of days. It was just, hallmarks of Al-Qaeda, hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. And I think it was the speed at which that story formed out of what was obviously a very confused event where they couldn't even tell you sort of how many explosions there'd been or how many buses had blown up. They couldn't maintain any consistency with that. But in the midst of all that inconsistency, they seemed absolutely certain about what happened and who was responsible. And that, I think, was probably what sort of threw me off and made me think, hang on, how do you tally those two things? I mean, it should be one or the other. Either they're really confused and they're not even sure what's happened, in which case they don't have a clue why it's happened or who did it, or they do have a really good handle on what's going on, in which case why are they telling us all of these contradictory stories that keeps changing every 5 minutes? I think it was that experience, above all others, that made me start questioning this. Right. And, of course, as soon, because I'd already started looking into 9/11 and what have you, and I already had some ideas of the sorts of possibilities that could really be going on here, I was always going to be asking those sorts of questions. I was always going to be wary of that kind of coverage. So there is that too.
I would also add to that, Tom, wouldn't you agree that it's really not the purpose of a true objective, unbiased media to speculate, particularly in the wake of such a confusing time, which seemed to be what so much of the corporate-owned news media was doing. You mentioned there the key phrase, the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. So I was very struck by the speculative nature of the media following the attack.
Oh, I'd certainly agree with you there. I mean, it's something actually that bothers me an awful lot about the alternative media as well, is that they're pretty bad for leaping in with speculations in the aftermath of pretty horrendously violent incidents. But certainly the mainstream media are more guilty, I would say, of it, and do it in a much to a much larger audience, and therefore it's that much more damaging. But yeah, they were even on the evening of the attack, the BBC were already talking about suicide bombers. You actually had a guy on Fox News the day before 7/7, when he heard that London, not Paris, had got the Olympics. He was saying they should have given it to Paris, because then the terrorists would have attacked Paris, and who'd care?
Right. Which is included in your documentary, which is quite unbelievable to see that.
Well, and then on the night of 7/7, he's one of these very first journalists to start talking about guys with backpack bombs and suicide bombers. And I mean, I'm not saying someone necessarily fed him that story. Of course, it could have happened. But it's very, very strange to have to watch this. It's very strange to sort of have to try and process this.
Quite jarring
for people. So that's partly why the speculation is so problematic. Is because it kind of prevents people from just following it through and going, okay, we know this, and now we know this, and now we know this, and now we know this, so that's why we think that. It's right, we're going to tell you 5 different versions of what's happened, and then we're going to shout at you as to who was responsible for it. You know, how are people supposed to make any sense of that and do anything with that?
Well, how much of it is simply that I think the general public, and of course we're not excluding ourselves from that, people in general, we seem to enjoy simple narratives. These were the good guys, these were the bad guys. And I think possibly the reason why people that come up with alternative views or alternative explanations, or simply raise questions as you've done in your documentaries, maybe the reason why they get shunned often is because it kind of messes up this simple story that we've all got told and has been repeated time after time.
Well, there is that problem with, I suppose, with almost every subject, in fact, that you could talk about, but certainly anything that involves history and therefore, by extension, anything that involves politics. People do like a simple narrative, ideally with 2 opposing factions, but usually you can squeeze in a third into the story if you really want to. But that's all they really want, is that, you know, this is what the struggle was about, it was between this, and ultimately this is what happened. And like you say, so much of this feeds into the good guys and the bad guys, the cops and robbers, the cowboys and Indians, whatever. Yeah, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, you then have this problem of people expecting reality to conform to soap operas. They expect it to conform to that standard of simplicity.
Also, people like an easy sort of layout of things, don't they? They want a villain, they want someone to blame and look at and point fingers at, and that's exactly what they got when 9/11 happened. Well,
and look at the culprits they gave us with 9/11 and 7/7, not just in terms of tapping into people's tribalism or racism or sense of a clan mentality, in the sense that all of these people were brown-skinned, they were very much foreign, the other people from the other side of the world, but also they were all dead. They were all suicide terrorists. So they could quite easily just say, there was these 4 men, and they blew up the trains and they blew up the bus, but they're now dead, so we don't have to catch anybody. We're kind of completely let off the hook here from really even having to investigate this crime in a serious manner, and they didn't investigate it in a serious manner. The police just didn't. In my second film, 7/7 Crime and Prejudice, when we got all of this new information from the inquests about what the police had actually done and what kind of information and evidence they'd gathered and what they'd made of it, how they turned this into the official story, I very much focused on that more in the second film, because it is just this bizarre tale of them turning up in places to collect CCTV when they shouldn't have even been there for another 2 days, because they had no reason for being there for another 2 days. How do you... This not only doesn't seem to have been a particularly serious investigation, it does seem to have been led by the nose by something. Exactly who that and what that extra something is, I'm not sure, but I think the police have just kind of been led a merry dance on this one.
I was going to ask you about that. What was the evidence used to name the bombers, and would you say it is questionable?
The evidence was that they found, they supposedly found the alleged bombers' bodies at the scenes and identified them with DNA, but there's a big problem in that in 3 cases, the descriptions of the bodies or pieces of bodies that they found at the scenes don't match the descriptions of a forensic anthropologist who then looked at these bodies and said, these look like suicide bombers, these look like they were in possession of the bombs at the time of the explosion. So how do you tally those up? Well, I'm not sure that you actually can. There is also the problem that none of these 4 guys were actually pronounced dead at the bomb sites when they sent a doctor around to go and, find all the bodies and tally them up and pronounce everyone dead and go through that formality. In each case, they didn't pronounce any of the alleged bombers dead. So were their bodies even at the scenes? Because that's quite fundamental. Because if they weren't, then they weren't there and they weren't suicide bombers.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's that. End of official story at that point.
Yeah.
There is also this question of finding mobile phones and identity cards and various other things at the scenes, but Mohammed Sadiq Khan's property was found at all 4 different scenes. That doesn't make any sense. The identity card they find for Jermaine Lindsay actually has a different name on it. I think he's called Tyrone Banks in this other identity card. What's that about? Why does this guy apparently have this separate identity? And more to the point, if you found an identity card saying Tyrone Banks, you wouldn't go to the press and say Jermaine Lindsay was the suicide bomber. So there's so much that's wrong with that process of how they identified them. And then, as I mentioned, once you get into the story of the CCTV and why the CCTV wasn't working and what they did find and then what they did about it, that whole story is completely fudged and muddled up. It makes absolutely no sense, and it seems that someone was feeding them information from another angle.
Just jumping on that point in regards to the CCTV, Tom, you show in your documentary the missing CCTV footage also. I'm wondering if you've ever got anywhere close to a decent explanation into why this is the case. What's kind of the closest you've got to that?
It depends which bit of CCTV you're talking about, I suppose, because there's lots of missing CCTV.
In particular, the 88 seconds, and then the car park, and then I believe
the
there's
Luton station.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, no. The closest, where I'm at right now with it is that I have done quite a close analysis of that CCTV in various respects, and this mysterious Jaguar car that's parked in the foreground on 2 different days. And there's a lot of indications there that whoever is parked in that car is some sort of spy. Just things like, it is the logical place if you were going to surveil that car park. That's the place that you'd park because it's on slightly raised ground and it's far away from the station, so there's not much chance of people parking around you. There's no reason for anyone to park around you, so it gives you a good view of the entire station car park and the entire entrance area. Things like that are very suggestive of the people in this car being spies or handlers or something along those lines. But in terms of trying to get access to these missing bits of CCTV, there is an 88-second gap in which the Jaguar arrives, and then there is a 76-second gap in which it disappears. I did file a Freedom of Information request with the Met, saying I would like the rest of this footage from Luton Station car park from that morning. And the first reply that came back was that they'd already released it, that this was the footage that was already available. And I was saying, no, I told you that this footage has been edited, and I'm looking for the bits that have been edited out. You can't tell me that the bits that you put out in the public, which I know are edited, aren't edited. It's this sort of very Kafkaesque response, or possibly just a completely stupid response, someone who didn't even read my request properly or understand it. So I have appealed against that, and I am complaining about it, but I don't seem to be getting very far with the person I'm complaining to. So I think my next step is to take it probably to the Information Commissioner and see if I can at least get an explanation out of them. What I think they might try and do is claim that the system does not record continuously at Luton Station, that it jumps from camera to camera, and that they might use that as their explanation for why there aren't continuous stretches of tape. But if they do that, my answer is probably going to be, why are the gaps not uniform then? Why is there an 88-second gap and then a 76-second gap?
Excellent point.
Surely it should be two 88-second gaps.
Logically.
So this will roll on and on. I'm still going to try and get that footage. I doubt they will give it to me, but I'm going to try, because someone's got to try.
Absolutely. What would it take to get that footage? I mean, do you think a certain amount of people, if there was a certain number complaining or asking to see this footage, would that make a big difference?
I do know that the way the Freedom of Information Act is kind of written, it does say if more than, if there are several different requests from several different people for the same thing, then it is more likely to be considered to be in the public interest to be disclosed. Because that's what it basically boils down to. That's what I've met with all of my adventures with the Freedom of Information Act, is public interest disclosure versus usually national security. And it's not an easy hurdle to overcome. But sure, if anyone else out there, if you just go on the Met Police's website and look for their Freedom of Information section, you just fill out a little electronic form or send them an email just asking for these additional, or all of the footage from Luton Station car park on the morning of 7/7, and see if you get anywhere.
Sounds easy enough to do, doesn't it? So,
well, it will take you literally 5 minutes. It may not get you anywhere, but if it doesn't, you've only lost 5 minutes.
So, bringing us kind of up to speed with the events of the last few weeks, we've seen the Aurora, Colorado incident, and then most recently in Wisconsin. In your opinion, Tom, I hate to use the phrase "bearing the hallmarks," but do these we have to be cautious with that. But do these events remind you, or can you draw parallels to other mass shootings in the past and other acts of terror that we've seen?
Neither event is something I've looked into particularly closely. I do know that in both instances you've got eyewitness reports speaking of basically more than one person being involved, whether it be more than one shooter or someone helping this guy get into the cinema in Aurora in Colorado. Certainly there are those same witness reports that you seem to get every time you have a mass shooting. You got it with the Breivik thing, you got it with Virginia Tech in 2007, you got it with Columbine, so on and so forth. But that's the strange thing to me, is that you always seem to get it, regardless of whether it's actually plausible that this person did just do it on their own, which is always a possibility. Even in cases where it seems pretty much nailed on that someone, either one or just one or two people did it on their own, you still seem to get reports of additional people being involved, of eyewitnesses thinking that there were additional shooters or whatever. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that, because it is something you always seem to get, almost a copycat effect. And there is a copycat effect running through mass shootings, particularly in America. And that's always the thing that's sort of hard to judge, is to what extent are people aping actions that they've seen on television and seen glorified in the press and through trials and what have you, and to what extent is there something more deliberate going on in terms of perhaps handling and provoking some of these people into doing these things. Or there is, as I say, there is always the possibility of an out-and-out false flag, of just creating a patsy who has nothing to do with the actual violence, and carrying out the violence through another means. So I'm kind of hedging, but I'm hedging because I haven't seen anything that would solidly persuade me either way with any of these incidents. But particularly this Wisconsin shooting at a Sikh temple, it did make me think of the Breivik shooting, particularly the supposed politics of this guy who used to be in military psyops.
Right. The motives behind it and everything, yeah.
Well, and just the nature of the shooting. It's a mass shooting. That's one type of attack when there are potentially so many you could choose from. So there's certainly echoes of Breivik in that.
So to play devil's advocate here for a second, Tom, why would governments handle, provoke, or indeed orchestrate incidents of mass terror against their general public, so to speak?
The simplest reason is to scare them. A scared public is always that much easier to control, and for some reason nothing scares people more than small-scale random violence. People seem to be more scared of a bomb going off and killing 20 people, or some guy with a machine gun shooting up a shop and killing 15 people. They seem to be more scared of that than they are of, well, far more rational things to be scared of. Such as unemployment in particular at the present. You don't get the same response to it for some reason. Even when the number of victims isn't particularly high, that sort of massacre, that sort of just kind of bludgeoning violence captivates people in a way that no kind of grand process like your economic status people would not get worked up about that in the same way as they would about a terrorist attack. Exactly why that is, I'm not sure, to be honest, but it is very effective. It is certainly very effective. You don't have to kill that many people. It's not like a war. You literally can kill 50 or 100 people, and everyone pretty much in the country will be clamoring for some kind of response to this. They will be saying, we're scared and we're angry and we're confused. Something needs to be done about this. And then invariably the government comes along with its, well, this is what we're going to do about it. And then the corporate shills come along and say, well, we're going to profit from it in this way.
Right. It's the old classic, create the problem, there's a reaction, and then here we are with the solution. But as you say, just on a rational, logical level, there's so many risks that far outweigh the chance of being injured or killed in a terrorist attack. So is it possibly just as people we need to develop more critical thinking skills and just more common sense perhaps, and not be such victims to our emotional judgment?
Well, I don't know if I'm not sure if being rational does actually mean being able to kind of overcome your emotional judgment. I think it's there is an element of that. A more rational person generally isn't as scared as a less rational person, but that you can't just get there that way. I think you have to have a more kind of optimistic and hopeful outlook on the world in order to be less scared. If you go back to ancient Greek philosophy, and you look at what they called hedonism, not what we would now call hedonism, very, very different concept. It was essentially freedom from pain and anxiety. That would be happiness. And if you could sustain that, that is what their hedonistic philosophy was that kind of happiness. And that's kind of crucial, freedom from anxiety. Because you're not sort of free from, I don't know. You can't be free from the possibility of these things happening, but what you can be free from is your own fear of these things happening. So that's what I think people fundamentally need to overcome in order for this whole kind of state terrorism thing to stop being effective. There's only so far you can go with teaching people to be rational about it. There's only so far you can go with investigating the thing and showing that it's a pack of lies. There's only so far you can go with any of those kinds of methods.
Sure.
But the fundamental change that needs to happen is basically just people need to kind of give up their fears and actually just embrace not being scared and trying to be optimistic.
Yeah, I agree. Well, do you think the 7/7, 9/11 and terrorist attacks like that, do you think they could have been staged to justify the war on terror and play on people's fear like this? At any moment there could be a terrorist attack. Is it something to do with that, do you think?
I think it's a little bit more subtle than that. I think that's one of the, if you like, the war on terror is the tabloid name that they've given to this thing.
Yeah.
And they've kind of stopped using it now as well, which is a bit odd. We're kind of in limbo as to what the status of the war on terror is, because they never announced that it was over. So, but they don't really use that phrase anymore.
never-ending war. Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. But it's but now it's evolving into something a bit different.
Yeah.
In as much as, early phase was the few years after 9/11, when you had foreign invasions, Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were full-scale invasions, not like Libya and Syria and other places. You also had a very extreme sort of, this is the enemy image, this is the thing that we are frightened of, this is the thing that we are fighting against. Whereas now, we seem to be entering more of what was kind of going on in Gladio, where you have what they call a strategy of tension, where you don't just have the sort of supposed great Muslim Islamic terrorist threat, you also have encroaching this not just nationalistic, right-wing, racist, extremist terrorist threat, but just the kind of random crazy person terrorist threat, that we're almost... It's less about a specific political narrative, we are kind of pro-West and anti-Muslim, and it's more just about there is a great big scary world out there and the threats are coming from all different angles. We don't even know what the threat is anymore, whereas before we were being told very specifically what it was. So I think it has kind of evolved a bit over the last, 12 years.
That's a long time.
But I agree with fundamentally what you're saying, that it's entirely possible that they staged these attacks in part to create a war on terror. I mean, the same people who, for example, the same family that was responsible for some of the security in the World Trade Center, just so happens to be at a conference back in 1979 where they coined the whole idea of the war on terror, and that's the Bush family. So there is, some very broad, thick lines running through all of this over quite a long period of time, where they were certainly discussing the idea of a war on terror long before the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, there are little clues throughout history, on like September the 11th, 1991, where George Bush Sr. gave his big speech about like a new world of the order, a new order of the ages. Sorry. They've given like little clues, throughout history. Well, do you think there was a lack of clues as to who caused this 7/7 explosion? Supposedly there was a speculation that there could have been a bomb from under the tram.
I think 9/11 was a much more overt event. It all happened on live TV. It was, after all, a massive live television event. That's how most people experienced it. Whereas with 7/7, most of it happened underground, and most of us have never seen those tube carriages, and most of us therefore don't really have a clue where that bomb that hit those tube carriages came from. What I do know is that if you look at the diagrams that the Metropolitan Police produced of where these explosions happened within the carriages and where the various people were, they don't really make any sense in terms of where dead people are, and they've got a whole string of people who survived with minor injuries right next to them, and they don't portray realistic explosions. So then on top of that, the predominance of witness statements and the predominance of the various diagrams that they drew of the carriages indicate that, firstly, much more likely that you had some kind of explosion coming up through the floor, and that would involve the bombs being either attached under the train or built into the floor, or there long before any supposed suicide bomber might get on the train. And also they in each case you have at least one witness, and in some cases many witnesses, talking about multiple holes in the floors of these carriages. I just don't see how that could be caused by a single backpack bomb. I just don't think it could be.
So they've come forward and they've said that, isn't there? Like, on one of the witnesses, he's released a book and he's trying to promote it. I mean, you never get this alternative side on the mainstream, do you? You never get any side rather than just like the mainstream official view.
Well, I don't know if that's strictly true, because they did make the Conspiracy Files show, and as bad as it was, it did at least discussed the fact that this idea was out there and that there were people talking about this. And they are also making a conspiracy road trip episode on 7/7 that they desperately tried to rope me into over a long period of time. and I eventually just sort of... I was trying to get them to actually talk to some people who were involved in the police investigation or the Intelligence and Security Committee investigations into MI5. You know, people like that, people who actually knew something about this. And I gave them a list of people and they just didn't seem interested in them. They didn't want to talk to anyone who actually had any authority to speak on this subject. And so I just sort of said, well, I'm not interested in talking to some random explosives expert about what he thinks might have happened. It just doesn't interest me. There's nothing to be gained for me from that experience, and so it didn't end up happening. But they are exploring this. They're just exploring it in a very twisted context, and a very propagandistic context.
Yeah, unfortunately.
There's been a lot of talk, Tom, over the last few weeks. With the Olympics, of course, dominating the media at the moment, about the possibility of a terrorist attack or some grand event, some mass murder or something like that happening at the Olympics. As we're coming to the close of the Olympics now, do you think this was some sort of act of disinformation? Do you think there's a real threat there? I mean, I'd be interested to hear what your take on that is.
Well, I have recorded a couple of conversations with Aaron Franz of the ageoftransitions.com in the last few days. They're up on my one of them's up on my YouTube channel. The other one is on Aaron Franz's YouTube channel as well. But if you go to his website, you'll be able to download them all and listen to them all. And we did get into this in some degree of detail. Again, I can't be certain what's going on here. It's very difficult to positively identify disinformation. It's quite easy to identify sort of white propaganda and black propaganda, but figuring out something that is specifically designed to deceive you, you're always in a position of sort of second guessing a bit. But I did feel that the particular sources of information that people were making these predictions about the Olympics on were a little too simple, a little too obvious. I just think whoever is doing this cultural production, whoever is ultimately behind shows like Spooks, whoever's ultimately behind the design of logos and designing architecture and all the rest of these things that people look at to, if you like, try and track coded messages and hidden messages, I think they also monitor people's reactions to them. And so once people have cottoned on to a particular channel of information, a particular way of getting information, of some kind of insight into a occult or secret world beyond the normal, political realm. Once people cotton on to those, they then start to use those channels for disinformation. I mean, that's just classic spycraft. If the Germans break your submarine code, you then continue to send out messages on that same frequency, coded in that same way, but you use it to fill it with disinformation. This is what they actually did in the Second World War. It's just an obvious way of using disinformation. That's just how you would do it. And so when I looked at the nature of the predictions versus the nature of the sources of information that people were basing them on, I just thought, this is a prime candidate for disinformation. This is an obvious thing to do, to make everyone think that some terrible, cataclysmic, horrible thing is going to happen. So then they don't spend their time kind of applying any political pressure or opposing the corporate seizing of the Olympics or any of these things that are actually really going on and really can be fought and potentially even struggles that can be won. What they spend their time doing is trying to predict exactly what sort of horrible thing is going to happen at the Olympics. And the amount of time and energy and effort that's gone into all of that just... It struck me as very strange and rather disappointing. Nothing seems to have happened.
No.
Sorry, go on.
No, it's all right. I'm sort of going down the same kind of path. About this whole numerology thing, some people have asked questions like this before, so I thought I'd take my opportunity. With 7/7 and 9/11, do you think there's some sort of weird sort of numerology thing that we don't quite understand? Or is it just a joke?
No. I think you actually described it relatively well. There does seem to be a weird numerology thing going on, because there's lots of numerological coincidences, and there's lots of them, so they're not really coincidences. But we don't really understand it. I don't think people really do, or rather, I don't think it gives us any predictive ability. It's not something we can model as such. It's only something we can kind of look back and say, you know what, in 9/11 there was an awful lot of occurrences of the same numbers that turned up in 7/7. For example, 77, Flight 77. You know, you can look back and make those connections, but I don't think it allows us to kind of look forward in any way, or in any kind of, it doesn't give us any way of predicting what's going to happen next. So yeah, it is just a kind of weird numerological thing that does seem to be going on, but we just don't have the knowledge and the methods and the science, if you like, of numerology to be able to really understand what it means, what it should mean to us, what it does mean to them, whatever.
You got to think then, like, were they planned then? If you look at like these different numbers, it's like, well, is it the people that are creating these things? Do they understand the universe a bit different than us? That's something that's a completely different subject, I know.
Well, maybe it's just that they think they understand the universe different to us. Maybe it's more so that they believe if they don't factor in all these weird numerological things, that the thing won't be successful.
Could be some sort of like ritualistic thing.
But maybe it should make no difference to us whatsoever. It's just what some weird people in intelligence services who are into blowing up their own citizens think that they need to do. It could be just, something as kind of irrelevant to us as that.
I guess one thing that can't really be disputed, Tom, is since 9/11, since 7/7, the world has changed and our perception of the world has changed, and it appears that more and more of our rights as citizens are being taken away. What do you think is the end game here? Where do you think this is all heading? There seems to be such an exponential increase in terms of talk about security and removal of people's liberties. So where's this all going?
Where is it all going?
It's a tough question.
I suppose I'll answer that by saying, what is it that kind of worries me about where I think we're going?
Sure.
Because what we're not just seeing the rise of the security state, the rise of the police state. We're not just seeing a massive increase in public fear and perception of threats. And obviously those two things go hand in hand. What we're also seeing is a process of normalization, a process where we are being acclimatized to having, for example, in this country, having armed police. That's not something we've sort of had in this country throughout our entire history, and certainly not throughout the entire history of the police force. But now, the notion of the police shooting dead a armed bank robber or something, it just kind of just happens, and people just accept it, and it doesn't cause any outrage. Whereas, 50 years ago, that reaction would have been different. So we're in this gradual process of not just where they're centralizing power and advancing and maintaining their power, but also where they are getting us more used to it, so that we, in fact, demand it, and not just demand it, but accept it even when it goes beyond our demands and beyond our expectations. So what worries me is that we eventually get to the possibility of, just hypothetically speaking, of the state carrying out a mass terrorist attack or a mass act of violence against its own people of any kind, and just doing it, and it not causing any outrage, and it not causing any, the natural reaction, which should be, this is terrible, this is, we need to get rid of these bastards. That's what worries me, is that we're becoming so acclimatized to them just sort of almost doing whatever the hell they like and saying, well, you deserve it and you need it for security, that we could actually get to the point where we're just kind of completely apathetic towards that possibility, towards that terrible possibility that is actually a reality in various instances, in various examples that we could talk about.
So you talk about what worries you there, Tom. What gives you optimism that perhaps a tide is being turned here, and, with people, particularly in the, I guess we could say, the alternative news community, starting to question their reality a bit more?
Well, I mean, what gives me optimism is that there is, both online and offline, we pay, I think, a lot of lip service, and rightly so, to the online alternative news, alternative research communities and movements. But it does exist offline as well. That gives me cause for hope, because people are actually asking the fundamental questions about, how did we get to where we are? Where are we going? How do we actually get the kind of world that we want, and how do we get what we want out of it? And a lot of these questions, of course, lead you into this problem of the kind of elite aristocratic psychopaths running most things. So I suppose what gives me optimism is A, that exists, B, that they're realizing some fundamental things about history that are very important for people to realize, but also the fact that even people who don't listen to podcasts and don't get their news online, or possibly don't even really watch the news, even they get a lot of this stuff. They get the fundamental things that, if you like, are the shape of our society is triangular, with a very small number of people at the top having most of the power and pretty much all the money. And just to get to that point is something I don't think history has necessarily ever been at before. So that's a pretty sound basis on which we can at least try to break this thing down and I don't know, replace it with something better. That is fundamentally what it comes down to. I know that's rather flippant and rather glib thing to say, but that's that's as simple as I can make it.
That's a positive way of looking at it.
No, I think absolutely. Just to piggyback on that, then, in terms of actions, what can we all do to accelerate our own cause for freedom and for kind of breaking down some of the stuff that we've talked about today?
Well, I think one of the decisions and one of the judgments you have to make is, I suppose, do you think the state can be turned into something better? Can it be reformed? Can it be held accountable? Can it be made accountable to us? And if you believe it can, then what you can do is apply as much pressure as possible, and remembering that the one thing they really respond to is scandal. Apply the pressure to the various political institutions and political individuals to try and realize that change and try and create that accountability, and just actually do it yourself. Don't just sort of say, well, the Intelligence and Security Committee are a complete load of incompetent, corrupt fools, and they've got absolutely no idea what's going on inside the intelligence services and are completely unfit for purpose. All of that's true, but I didn't just get to that point. I thought, right, so I'm going to do my best to try and hold MI5 and MI6 accountable for this myself by investigating the hell out of every single thing that they've said about this and demonstrating how everything that they've said about it is a pack of lies. That's from my own sort of example, not to kind of big myself up. I'm just saying, that's the kind of thing you can actually do. There's no reason why you can't.
It's brilliant, Nick.
But then there's the other possibility, which is if you genuinely think the kind of corporate state system cannot be reformed, cannot be made accountable, cannot be made anything other than this sort of extortion racket system, then, well, I'm not in favour of violent overthrowing of governments. I don't think that will ever get us where we want to be, but just try and bypass it. Just try and get as far away from it and ignore as much of it as possible, and proceed from a basis of what's actually important in your life, what is morally good to you to do, and just try and build organizations, businesses, charities, whatever structures and organizations you can build, that will just, if you like, naturally dissolve the state, make the state not make it so that we don't have any reason to think we need the state anymore. And then it actually sort of will wither away in the Marxist sense. It's not going to do it organically. That's what Marx kind of predicted, and it hasn't happened. But I think we can kind of make it go away by just if you like, replacing it ourselves with what we can do, and then it doesn't need to exist anymore.
It's like non-compliance, isn't it, really?
Well, there's a big element of non-compliance, but also more positive things, more, the fact that when someone gets hit by a bus, an ambulance comes along and picks them up and takes them to a hospital, that's a really good thing. There's a lot of places in this world where that doesn't happen. But does that mean that the NHS, we have to accept a fully centralised, nationalised healthcare system, or could we not, if you like, reform the NHS into a series of regional charities? I'm just sort of speculating here, but that would be the sort of thing whereby it would be less of a imposition. It would still provide the same things that most people actually want, but it wouldn't do it by taking their money by force, and it wouldn't do it by saying you have to do it within this rigid framework and we are going to tell you exactly what you can and can't do with it. You can still sort of provide all of these things that people want without those rather horrifying aspects that come with them because it's a state monopoly and it's all centralised.
That's fantastic. I think you've really eloquently just outlined some of the positive things that we can do, Tom, because I think a lot of times these issues can be talked about, but there's never any sort of there's never any sort of action that we can actually do to make things better. So I really appreciate your words on that. I understand that George Orwell happens to be your favorite writer. I'm just curious to ask, in your view, how relevant is Orwell to today?
Well, Orwell basically is the War on Terror, or 1984 at least is the War on Terror, predicted 50 years before it actually happened. As a model for understanding 9/11 and the post 9/11 world that we now live in, I would say 1984 is probably the best kind of single roadbook guide that you'll ever get. So I think it's abundantly relevant in that respect. But it also, my favourite bit of Orwell's writing is not 1984. It's his essay "Politics and the English Language," because he goes into sort of what, in some respects, what we've been talking about this whole time, kind of how to phrase political radicalism in a way that it motivates people towards optimism and towards action. That's sort of what I tried, in many respects, what I tried to do in my films and what I try to do with my various kind of research and presentation work. But as we were just talking about, that's what it kind of fundamentally boils down to, is how do you get people to, if you like, have a spiritual change and an attitudinal change, so that they just start to realise that we can all just do all of these things ourselves. I mean, we all do them anyway. We all, if you like, we all pay for the NHS anyway. So why don't we just sort of pay for it without having this great big centralised health department?
Right.
It really is quite simple if you think of it in those terms.
Common sense alert.
From the department of the bleeding obvious. I suppose what I'm saying is, when I read Politics in the English Language, I see it as a extremely successful political writer outlining the secrets of successful political writing, and as someone who is into producing media, who is into communicating, I find that extremely important. And it also functions as a series of, he makes a series of criticisms of political writings and of the common traps, the sort of hackneyed metaphors that people just shove into a sentence in order to skip over, quite often, the most important part of their argument, the most important part of what they're trying to persuade you of politically. So it's not just a guide to how to positively go about trying to present information in a way that inspires political radicalism. It's also a guide to the common logical fallacies and rhetorical tricks that political writers will use to try and deceive you. And that is as important today as I think it ever was, because that, with the internet especially, is where so much of this battle is being played out. And it's going to be the people who understand the tricks of the other side and also who have the linguistic capabilities to be persuasive without resorting to those tricks, it's ultimately them who, if you like, are going to win the argument. And it's not just about winning the argument, but if we can win the argument, that's going to help. So I strongly recommend Politics in the English Language. I think it's a brilliant essay.
So with that being said, Tom, first of all, we're very thankful for your time today. So much food for thought in what you've said. Could you please just direct people to finding out more about you, your work, and in particular the 2 documentaries that you've done on 7/7?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me on your show. It's been a really pleasant conversation with the two of you. Some really interesting questions. I think we've discussed some good stuff here. Hope people enjoyed listening to it. My website is investigatingtheterror.com. You can stick that into any search engine or whatever, and it'll come up. You can find on that the videos section. That has all of my 7/7 material, both short videos, interviews, and my 2 documentaries, Seeds of Deconstruction and Crime and Prejudice. You can find them all on investigatingtheterror.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again, Tom, for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been really good talking to you guys.